I was inspired by the scripture passage that Steve read this morning, and what I was inspired by was, once again, how much Jesus does teaching from either a body of water or in a boat. And so rather than dive into that particular teaching, I used it as a jumping off point to think about the lessons that I have been learning from the water and boats. Jeanette and I were on retreat last week in Minnesota, and we took our relatively new kayaks with us. We began with baby steps on a small lake nearby and then ventured into a couple of rivers. It's the rivers that seem to teach the lessons. Before we decided to kayak a 7-mile stretch of the Rum River north of Minneapolis, Jeanette did copious research, including talking to a river guide who takes weekly groups of kayakers on the river. She found out some great information, and we decided it would be a good river for us to try. Just before we went out, literally in 20 minutes before we got into our kayaks, we received a text from our eldest child saying that because of the astrological conditions, there was danger associated with bodies of water, and she encouraged us to be very careful. We reassured her that we were not taking on anything difficult and went ahead with our adventure, hoping for the best and thinking we were prepared for the worst. The first thing you should know is that our kayaks are foldable paper origami kayaks. Impossible, right? Well, I brought one so that you would know I wasn't lying. I mean, I hope you don't think I lie in general, but because this is so unbelievable, this is one of the origami kayaks. Now, Jeanette has been trying to convince me for months that we should get origami kayaks. And I was saying to her during all of those months, I understand why you would think they were cool, and I don't understand how they stay afloat in the long term. Now, apparently that makes me the skeptical one in our relationship, but I just want to point out that I was allowing for the possibility that it might stay afloat once. So I think that makes me not a skeptic. Well, I wanted to show you, I'm not going to set the whole thing up this morning, but you get the idea that it unfolds and you do a few things and gets it into place. And then when you're done, you put the stuff back in and it folds back up. I got to do this later because it's, whoops. There we go. I'll do the rest later. But literally, in 5 minutes, the kayak sets up. Now, the reason I was not in favor originally of these origami kayaks is that they're made out of paper, essentially. But she convinced me. We ordered the kayaks, and they both arrived right before we left for Minnesota. So this was our first outing with both kayaks. Once we learned how to unfold them and set them up properly, they worked great, and they actually stayed in the shape of kayaks rather than folding up midstream, so to speak. So lesson number 1. Believe in things and people you cannot imagine to be possible. Our lack of imagination will never stop the innovators, or for that matter, the God of all creation. An origami kayak is a brilliant impossibility that is now an actual reality. Do you think it's fair to say that in the Midwest, anytime you commit a chunk of time to being on the water, you have to understand that it's not entirely predictable in terms of the conditions? We were keeping an eye on the sky because rain had been predicted, but only at about 30 to 40%. We were prepared to get a little rained on, if indeed any rain came, and we knew to get out of the water if lightning came, but lightning was not supposed to be part of the rain. What we were totally unprepared for in any way was the ferociousness of the biting flies. Now, if you are from Minnesota or have spent any time in Minnesota in the summertime, I want you to put that in the comment section so people know to feel empathy for you as well as me in this story. We knew it was fly season, but 2 days earlier, we had spent hours on a different river, and not one fly bothered us. In the first few minutes we were on this river, we were encircled and bombarded by biting flies. Jeanette said I had at least 30 circling me at any one time, and she thinks she might have had 20. I would have said 1,000 and 500, easily, at least. They weren't biting our legs, but they were constantly bouncing off of our faces and biting our hands as we were paddling, and then sometimes biting our faces and other spots. I had bug spray in our bag, that was our wet bag, but I was too afraid to stop long enough to get it out for fear of what they would do if I stayed still for more than 5 seconds. My strategy was to move like crazy, and that's just what I did. I just kept paddling. After about 15 minutes on the water, I realized the water was not moving. Now that might sound funny because we were on a river, and usually rivers move. But we realized that instead of cruising through the 7-mile stretch, we were the only things moving us, and we were going to have to paddle the whole way if we wanted to get to our end destination. We were feeling strong and adventurous, and at that point, 15 minutes in, we were sure the flies would tire of circling us and eventually leave us alone, because surely flies can't fly 7 miles in a row. Lesson number 2, know your limitations and your desired ratio of work and enjoyment. If you can change your experience with a little bug spray, do so. If not, it might be better to get off the river than to be miserable for the entire time and experience. You don't like being miserable, and no one around you likes you when you're miserable. We were the only ones on the river as far as we could see, and we tried to take in the scenery as we were paddling. Unlike the river we had been on a couple of days earlier, there were homes that lined the riverbanks at various intervals, and many places where people had gotten rid of their junk by the river. Seriously, we saw some things, junk like old cars, old houses, old tires, things like that. We were not impressed, but mostly saddened by the neglect that we saw. About 2 hours in, we had been talking about the lack of wildlife other than the flies, when all of a sudden we saw an enormous bird in a tree in front of us. As we got close, and we were very close, we realized it was an eagle. I pulled out my phone because I love capturing moments like this. And I began taking pictures. All I could think about was wait until Dave and Betty Guylan see this picture. And a whole host of other names came into my mind of people who would appreciate such a regal bird and, if I'm honest, such an amazing shot. I could not believe it was sitting still and just watching us as we got so close. I was trying to get just the right angle. I had already taken probably 5 photos of it, but I wanted just one more photo. So I switched the phone into my left hand because I needed to paddle with my right to get me in the right spot. Now, you know this is not going to end well. I was holding my phone like this, and a fly landed literally right here. And because I was holding my phone with this hand, I took my right hand and I slapped the fly. And I was not holding my phone tightly enough. And it went flying out of my hand and into the water. I tried to scoop it up, but it literally sank immediately. The water in this particular river was murky and creepy and scary, 0 visibility. But I paddled around and around, hoping to see a flash of light or anything, or thinking maybe this case actually floats. But nothing. The sludge-colored water all around me stayed sludge-colored, and my phone did not magically appear. It was clear within a few minutes that it was gone forever. And the worst part was that I was pretty sure the amazing pictures I had just taken of the eagle were lost forever. I did not think they had time to upload to the cloud, and I was right. I lost all those pictures. There are some who have suggested that maybe I lost my phone because I needed to disconnect. I can't imagine that's the lesson in this for me. Lesson number 3. When there are biting flies, don't take your phone out unless it is attached to your body with something that can keep it from falling. And when your eldest daughter predicts danger or catastrophe, it's wise to be a little more careful than usual. After I lost my phone and was convinced that I would never recover my brilliant photos, I think an accurate description of me was crabby. Some might even use the word intolerable. The flies had traveled miles with me so far and were not letting up, but in fact, I think, had called in some reinforcements. I was ready to be done, and I kept paddling hard, hoping that the end was near. Not the end of my life, but I mean the end of our paddle time. As we glided by some trees, all of a sudden, an enormous gray heron lifted off and literally flew probably within 20 feet directly over our heads. She was so close that we could hear the thunderous flapping of her wings. In my frustration and resentment toward the flies, I had not seen her at all. Anyone who has seen a heron that close knows the majesty I am describing. She was close enough that we could not only hear her wings, but see the shape of her feet. For a minute, I forgot about my misery, and I was filled with gratitude. And then I went back to trying to keep ahead of the flies, which was futile. As we rounded a bend a few minutes later, there she was on the riverbank, just to our right. She stood and watched us, and as we floated by silently, she took off again within just feet of us and flew over us as though she were leading the way. We thanked her. We thanked God for her magnificence and went back to the complete drudgery of paddling. Further on, when we were not expecting to see her again, when one of us might have been complaining vociferously about the flies again, there she was, waiting for us, this time on the left side of the river. We believed in that moment that she was guiding us, or at the very least, accompanying us. She had redeemed part of our experience of that river. Lesson number 4. The biting flies of the world will forever try to take your best attention and energy. Be careful to watch for the herons of the world, because they fill you with awe and they remind you of the beauty that is there if you will lift your head up and look. Well, it turns out there is crabby and then there is crabby. After we had been paddling for more than 2.5 hours with virtually no break, I was filled with relief to see the sign for the park where we were to end our paddle. As I am wont to do, I began going faster, thinking the end was just up ahead, maybe just around that bend. When it wasn't, I asked my fearless partner, who had done all of the research, why we weren't there yet. She said she wasn't sure, but that she remembered the park was fairly big, and she was sure we were still in the park, so we should just keep paddling because surely we would be there soon. A few minutes later, I asked if there were any chance that we had left the park without knowing it and were now just paddling on into eternity. She stopped for a minute, which meant braving the flies, and she checked her phone, which was still in her boat and not in the water. She said the map showed that we were still in the park. And then she said, "Oh, now I kind of remember that the guy I talked to said, once you get to the park, you have to paddle for about an hour to get to the end." To which my response was, "I will only give you 10 minutes more. That's it." And off I went, hoping that in those 10 minutes, I would be there. In 10 minutes, I insisted she check again because we were at a Y junction, which seemed unusual for this part of the river, and the chance that we could go the wrong way was good. She assured me we were still in the park and that we weren't quite halfway around the squiggles on the map that we had to get around in order to get to the end. I was speechless. I took off and I was fuming. Just to be clear, I wasn't mad at her, but I was definitely mad at the flies, who apparently can fly 7 miles in one effort, and mad that we weren't finished yet. I was so mad, in fact, that I almost missed the beautiful doe who was lying down and resting on the edge of the riverbank, watching us as we went by. She did not seem fazed by us or by the flies. We still had another 15 minutes after we saw her before we reached the end point. We had paddled for 3.5 hours, and the flies accompanied us all the way to the car, managing to bite us a few more times before we could get the kayaks put away. Lesson number 5. One of the most important tools in life is knowing how to adjust your attitude mid-river or mid-stride or mid-experience. Some of us are better at this than others. While I was able to come to acceptance fairly quickly about my phone at the bottom of the river, I was much less able to adjust my attitude about the flies. I did try. I used my deep breathing to relax. I used my best distraction techniques. I used my self-talk. Nothing worked. And that leads back to knowing your limitations. If biting flies are your limitation, know that. And then when you find yourself in their midst, get out of the river as soon as you can. It also speaks to the research you do in preparation. When one 7-mile stretch takes an hour and a half, and another 7-mile stretch is supposed to take 5 hours, get curious about why. There is something different about the two. Maybe it's the current or lack thereof. And even though you might think you can do the same distance in a similar time, there's a chance you can't. Sometimes we over-research things. Sometimes we under-research things, and we find ourselves in experiences we did not expect. What choices do we have in those circumstances? Lastly, and perhaps this is another lesson, or perhaps it is really more the story of our lives. We are constantly experiencing things that we can learn from if we will. The danger or the distraction for us is that we move through life quickly enough that we often don't stop to wonder what was learned or what something was about, or even to reflect on an experience. I guarantee you it was not while I was paddling down that river that I thought about lessons from the river. It was only in the days afterward, when Jeanette and I talked about the experience, that I could begin to do some reflection on the specifics of the day and on my particular experience of it and attitude toward it. Some of you are also having some adventures this summer, even close to home. Some of you might be feeling as though there has been no adventure whatsoever, and that's an experience in itself. As you live through this ongoing and uncertain and unpredictable pandemic and time of civil unrest and potential, how are you experiencing it? If you want to offer some things in the comments while I ask these questions, feel free to do that. What are you doing and not doing in the midst of your experience? What feelings of anger or frustration or peace or gratitude are you having? What are the biting flies for you? Why is there a lack of flow for you? What unnecessary risks are you taking, and why? What tools do you have for adjusting your attitude? What are you refusing to believe because of its impossibility? And a final word for all of us. If we are in the midst of something we have chosen to do, or been asked to do, or been called to do, and our whole focus is simply getting to the end of it, this can be important information for us. The exceptions would be medical and dental procedures. If I get to church every Sunday and think, I can't wait until this service is over, something is not right with my soul. If you get to work every day and think, I can't wait to be done with work today, or I can't wait for retirement, something might not be right with your soul. If you reach a point in life where you think, I can't wait for this life to be over, something is probably not right with your soul. While it is a fact of life that there are biting flies and difficult times, this does not have to be the whole story. God does not send the biting flies to you, or encourage the river to swallow the phone, or stop the current. Those things happen, and God says, I am here. I have given you strength enough to keep paddling. I will be here with you even beyond the end. And along the way, I invite you to look at the birds of the air as the reminders of my deep love for all of creation, including you, even when you're crabby. Amen.